Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And it's December, and we're still doing 80th anniversary of D-Day shows. We've got a few more weeks before I'll have to kind of say the 81st. But today and tomorrow, we have two Normandy shows lined up. Today, Chris Barrington Brown looks at the monumental build-up to Overlord. We all love logistics content on the channel, so I'm delighted to welcome Chris. And then tomorrow, Niels is back. He was with us on June the 6th, but he's doing a deeper dive into defending Normandy. So this is the first and second volumes of his masterful books about what the Germans were preparing in Normandy for Overlord. So we're doing both sides of the channel today and tomorrow. But I'll bring in my guest in now. Good evening, Chris. How are you today?
Hi, pretty good. Thanks very much, Paul.
So I always like to ask first-time guests how you define yourself within the sphere of military history, because there's a lot of data in your content there, and there's your website that I've linked to in the description below. So do you have a label for yourself and the work you do?
Well, I'm an amateur historian, I think is the best way of putting it. But I'll explain a little bit about that when I explain where I've come from and therefore why I'm here where I am.
Brilliant stuff. So you've come on with a PowerPoint, which we'll bring up now. So folks, if there's questions for Chris about kind of the broad sweeping, how he does his work, we'll save them for the end of the show. But if there are ones about some of the data and some of the information he's presenting, we'll address them as we go along. But there's a lot of content coming your way. So I think some of your questions will be answered as we go along. But I'm going to hand over to Chris to take us through this. And we love logistics, so we're just going to sit back and get the virtual popcorn out and enjoy the presentation. So over to you, sir.
Great. Thanks very much indeed. So as introduced, I'm Chris Barrington Brown. I'll explain where I've come from in a few moments. But we'll start with a quotation which is attributed to Omar Bradley, who's supposed to know a bit about warfare. Amateurs talk tactics and professionals study logistics. Now, that's not pithy enough today. So I bumped into some naval officers who said that now they use no missions without logisticians. So although it's not very sexy, logistics is absolutely critical to achieving anything in warfare. So assuming that this is going to go next. Right. So a bit about my background. So I was a soldier for 12 years as a regular and 33 years as a reservist, mostly in the cyber sphere. But over those years, I'm supposed to understand a bit about the military. I ran a small business doing defense and counterterrorism software. So I'm supposed to know a bit about marketing and things like that. I'm an orienteer. If you could actually see me fully, you realize that my shape means I'm no longer a very fast orienteer. But I'm really into mapping and finding my way around on maps. I'm an unashamed computer geek and have been all my life. And in June of 22, I sold my business to my employees and retired. I thought, what the hell am I going to do? Having been busy for 45 years or so, what on earth was I going to do? So, as a military person, I've spent all my life being told that D-Day was the most amazing thing and so on. But when I started reading about it, it was always starting with people charging ashore on the beaches or jumping out of aeroplanes and very little about how they got there. And as a military person, I wanted to know how were they fed and equipped and hidden and trained and all of those other things which you need to get right before an operation can succeed. So I thought, well, maybe I'll write a book. And then I rapidly realized that this book would be 200 or 300 pages long with 10,000 pages of annexes, which would be difficult enough to carry, let alone to put together in a form that was attractive. So park all of those things. And I'm wandering around the D-Day story at Southsea, and I come across this map. And some of you may have seen it before. It's a map of the area around my home, which has been expanded there in the purple box around Romsey near Southampton. And it shows where all the camps, the wading pits, the hospitals, the bomb dumps, everything else was. And I had one of those duh moments. Of course, there must have been such things. Every operation, of which luckily there have been very few that I've been on in the military, and all the exercises have always had maps like this, which tell you where to find your food and petrol and all those things. And of course, there must have been these for D-Day. And this is area C. So I thought, oh, well, there must be at least area A and B. And of course, as we'll see in a moment, there are actually 22 areas which had these maps. And I thought, well, maybe I could use my computer skills and historical skills to take the information that's on that map, which is, of course, a 1940s 1 inch to 1 mile map, and put it onto modern mapping so that people could see what happened in their backyard. I thought, well, maybe there's a germ of an idea here. Maybe I could do a website. And then I came across this, and I'm sure that all of you, being keen people, will understand this. This is project 44.ca, and don't leave now, but when you finish this, go and look at this website if you haven't seen it. It is absolutely brilliant.
Oh, you can waste a few hours there, though, can't you?
Okay.
But it's not wasted. It's all time spent in reconnaissance.
Yeah, but it starts with everybody charging ashore on the beaches, which sort of makes my point earlier that the logistics isn't really covered. But I thought that if I could do something 10% as good as this, I would have done something useful for humanity. So I thought, I'm going to produce a website. So I then thought, well, you've got to have a reason for doing it. What are you going to try and do? So I thought, well, maybe I'll try and answer 3 questions. So how did the logistics work? And that's mostly text with some diagrams and a few maps and things like that. Then I've already explained about what happened in my area. So you can go anywhere on the map on the website, anywhere in England and Wales. I'm afraid for various boring technical reasons, Scotland and Northern Ireland don't get a mention. But you can see what happened in your area on old maps, new aerial photography, old aerial photography in some places. And so you can see what went on. And then what units were where and when, because people want to know where their grandfather's unit was and so on. But the most difficult part of this whole project is trying to create something which will work in 20 years' time. I mean, this 80-year thing's all very well, but I'm really interested in the 100th anniversary. So how can you produce something which is electronic and it still work in 20 years' time? We'll come back to that at the end. So first of all, most important thing in the military, or so the military tell you, is people. Although actually, if you've been in the military and you realize that quite often we're way down below paper clips and carbon paper in terms of importance. But anyway, let's start with the people. So a lot of people think that the whole of the UK in late May 44 was like a coiled spring with all of these people ready to rush across the channel. In fact, only 750,000 people in 21 Army Group were ready to do that. There were another 250,000 who were in the air defence of Great Britain, who were basically defending the home base. And you'll note that the V1 started appearing just after D-Day, so ADGB was incredibly busy. There were another almost 1 million in home forces who were equipping, protecting, getting everybody ready to go. And then there's the reason there's query on the RAF is I don't actually know how many people there were. My guess is about 250,000. I can find out how many people there were in the RAF on the 1st of June, but that's worldwide. How many there were in the UK, if anyone knows, please let me know. And then to give you another breakdown, the US forces, there were about 1.5 million in the UK on the 1st of June, of whom 600,000 odd were ground forces, 400,000 odd were air forces. But the interesting figure there is that 375,000 were in the services of supply, who were there to supply all of the logistic material for those ground and air forces. So a huge number. And there is some statistics around which suggests that for every 1 fighting person in the Western forces, there were 14 people behind them providing the logistic backup. There are lots of ways of measuring that, so I'm happy to argue that case, but 1 to 14, whereas the same maths done on the Germans was 1 to 3, which may suggest why they were really good at tactical rapid attacks, counter-attacks, things like that, but why overall they lost, because they didn't have the logistic backup, which was available for the West. Anyway, to get those 1.5 million Americans across, there was an operation called Bolero, which was to move all of the forces, both air and land, across the Atlantic. And there are a few statistics there which you can digest. The few which I'll pull up: 900 railway locomotives, because it was known that we would have destroyed most of them on the far side by the time that the invasion happened. So there were 900 large locomotives which were made specially for the UK because it had a different track to the Americans. And 52 field bakeries. So the Americans arrived and found that the British field bakery was so much better than theirs that they just bought 52 of them straight away. And by the 1st of June, they were making £500,000 of bread a day. For those of you who are too young, a pound is about half a kilogram. But about 60% of the requirement. So the Brits had to produce the rest for the Americans, as well as for all of their own. So how do these people get here? Well, there is the Queen Elizabeth and the Queen Mary, and the two queens moved 1.6 million people across the Atlantic during the war. That's a pretty large number. They normally had, it was no sort of cruise. Normally they would have 2,000 passengers and about 900 staff. But when they were turned into troop ships, they would normally move 7,000 to 9,000 at once. And at one stage, they went up to 11,500 in one trip. If you were, there were a whole load of people doing their lifeboat drill. If you were unlucky, you came across as a 3-decker. So there are some troops coming across. If you were really unlucky, a 4-decker, and very, very unlucky, a 5-decker. Now, even though the Queens were considered to be so fast that the U-boats couldn't catch them, and they were allowed to come across as fast as possible as single runners rather than in a convoy, they still took 7 to 9 days to come across the Atlantic. So imagine being in those conditions for 7 to 9 days. Not a pleasant cruise. Anyway, we now got our people on into the UK, and we now need to decide how we're going to attack the continent. And the obvious first stage is going to be using these two particular types of ship. So the landing craft tank, which is on, I don't know whether can you see my mouse on there?
No, we can't. No, sorry.
No. Okay, so up above hards, you'll see an LST, landing ship tank, and on the other side, a landing craft tank. Sorry to teach grandmother to suck eggs, but you need to reverse everything onto these, because when you want to land on the far side, you want to come out fighting. So you can't turn around on board, so you back onto it. The trouble is that if you back a whole load of vehicles onto these ships when they're on a beach, the beach rapidly erodes. So you need to have a fake beach, a hard beach, or hard, let's call it. Unfortunately, making one of these things is a bit of a pain, because you lay your concrete and then the next tide comes and washes it all away. And it takes 4 weeks to cure. So along comes a guy called Vassal Charles Steer Webster. I mean, you'll notice I have a double-barreled name, but I have double-barreled name envy with this guy. He was a sapper, and he invented the thing which is known colloquially as the chocolate block. And it's precast concrete with steel hawsers in it, which means it's slightly flexible. And you can see that it's maneuverable by a couple of people. You just flatten the beach, put it down, and you've immediately got your hard. So these were put around the coast. And hopefully we've now got a map here of the marshalling areas. So you remember I said area C was around Southampton. Well, there it is down at the bottom. But there are actually all of these hards produced all around the coast, about 70 of them, including some training ones up in Scotland. Because at this stage, we didn't actually know where we were going to land. And so they put hards all the way around the coast, from Great Yarmouth round to the south coast of Wales. And behind each of these, they put the infrastructure which was needed to mount the various forces through these hards. And we'll come back to that map in a moment. So what do you need behind your embarkation area where the hard is? Well, you start off in a concentration area. And those of you who've been in the military will know that when you move from a peacetime footing to a wartime footing, which is what you do in a concentration area, all of those things which you wanted and asked for and the quartermaster said you couldn't have, like new boots or a vehicle that worked properly or extra men or whatever, suddenly when you get into a concentration area, the doors of the storehouses fly open and everything you could imagine, and quite a lot of things that you couldn't, suddenly become available. So you move from a peacetime army to a wartime army in your concentration area. And at that point, you also do the first stage of waterproofing, which takes 4 days or so. It involves some horrible stuff, which I'll show you in a minute. The trouble is that once you've done it, you can only drive for 100 to 200 miles before your engine seizes. So those concentration areas need to be within 200 miles of the embarkation area. At this point, you're still self-sustaining. So the units can feed themselves and administer themselves and so on. But what you don't want once you land is all of the infantry in one ship and the tanks in a second ship and the artillery in a third ship, because they'll be in different places on the beach. And if one of the ships gets sunk, you don't want to lose all your gunners simultaneously. So you need to mix everybody up. You do that in a marshalling camp. So you'll see that from the top, they've come in the concentration area. They then move into marshalling camps, at which point they discard the residues, and about 40% of the unit aren't going to invade. They'll be called forward when they're needed. And that's the cooks, the bottle washers, the clerks, all those sorts of people. And they're sent off to places like Aldershot, Southend, Lark Hill, where they sit training and twiddling their thumbs until they're called forward. The 60% who are left are broken down into shiploads, so they actually know which ship they're going to be on, but at which point they become non-self-sustaining because all of their support has disappeared or has been broken up into other camps. So these camps, the marshalling camps, are run by what are called the hotel staff. And if you read the comments from senior officers at the time, they said, we can't possibly call them hotel staff, so our chaps will become soft. But hotel staff stuck. And in those marshalling camps, looked after by the hotel staff, you do your next stage of waterproofing, which doesn't take long, but once you've done it, you can only drive for 20 miles. So all of those marshalling camps have got to be only 20 miles inland from the hard. And then eventually you'll call forward, you get to the hard, and you do the last bits of waterproofing, which you normally do on the boat or maybe on the quayside. And it's things like taking off the band which drives the cooling fan, because if you try to land in water with a cooling fan going round, it sucks water into the engine and you stall, and life becomes very unpleasant. But in the last little bits of waterproofing mean that you can only drive for half a mile before your engine seizes. So that's why you do it right at the end. For those who are interested in this sort of thing, there was a wonderful book produced by John Dalgleish called We Plan the Second Front, just after the war. I think he was over-egging it a bit because he was a major in one of the commands who was doing some of the planning. We Planned the Second Front is a bit over the top, but he was still very good, and his book is excellent. It's not really available except in second-hand shops, but there is a republished version called After Dunkirk. I make no money on this, but go to Amazon, you can buy it. It's great.
Yeah, I've got a copy of the original. I found it. I've been scanning my books into an app recently, so I found that one on my shelf. I forgot I had it. Just a quick question for you that's going to come up later about how much of the brains behind all this concept, whether they are sticking with just the planning for what will eventually become Overlord, or whether they're taking advice from what's going to be happening in Sicily, in Anzio, Salerno. Is there any kind of cross-pollination between the landings over there, or is all this being sort of done separately in-house in the UK?
No, a lot of people were posted back from Sicily and not Anzio, it was a bit too late, but Sicily and the southern toe of Italy. Yep. Those people were brought back to the UK, and their knowledge was moved across to the planning staffs, as far as I can tell. But of course, not everything is transferable. It's different conditions, different. It was a posed landing in Normandy as opposed to a fairly unopposed landing in Sicily, for example. So anyway, we've now got everybody marshaled and so on. We need to do the waterproofing. I wouldn't dream of suggesting that any of you sniffed glue as kids, but if you remember that smell of Bostik, absolutely wonderful stuff. Well, you take the Bostik and you mix it with asbestos, mix it together, and you end up with a black stuff like plasticine, which you then smear over all of the bits of the vehicle which might be affected by water. And you can see there someone with a tub of this horrible stuff. There's a rumor that hardly anyone who did this lived to a ripe old age, because they all had asbestos poisoning. But anyway, there are waterproofing, and they're smearing stuff around the dials inside a vehicle. I need to point out here that as an army officer, I took an oath to be rude about the RAF at all possible occasions.
Oh, of course, we would not expect anything else.
And so even the RAF got their hands dirty in this. I jest, of course, because without the RAF, we wouldn't actually be able to do any of this. But don't tell the RAF I said so. And here they are at Old Sarum, which is where they concentrated all of their vehicles and units, getting their hands dirty waterproofing. So those marshalling camps, which I mentioned, I mean, most people think of them as that picture in the middle, tents in the middle of that's Denmead, just north of Portsmouth. But actually, if you look on the left-hand side, that's the West Ham dog track, which had 4,000 people in it. The tents are in the middle there. You can't really see them, but if you go to the website, you can download that map and have a look at it in detail. And then all the vehicles parked to the top and top left of the picture there. And then there's another phrase you might come across called sausages. And particularly in the extreme southwest, the intention was to only use the camps once, so for the assault itself rather than for the build-up. And so rather than put in a lot of infrastructure, the idea was you blocked off two ends of roads going down a valley somewhere in Cornwall, and then you told 2,500 men to go and make themselves into little 250-person encampments and pup tents and so on. And because you didn't know exactly where they were going to be, so you just drew a blob on the map. They looked like sausages, so they were called sausage camps. And that's where that came from. The number of camps and the size of them is all based on how many troops per tide the hards that they supported could manage. And they all came in groups of 4, because one camp would be being filled, one would be being marshaled, one would be emptying, and then one would be being cleaned by the hotel staff. At least in theory. The reality was it didn't quite happen like that, because no plan survives contact with the enemy, or indeed British soldiers. But anyway, that's why they ended up with them. So Southampton, for example, there are 20 or so camps, whereas in the New Forest, going out through Leap and Lymington, there are only 8. So it would depend on how many troops could be moved out on each tide. The camps were sometimes mixed, and there you can see British soldiers being equipped by both British and American staff. They're being given their bags of vomit and their emergency chocolate ration. Those of you who remember Spike Milligan, well, he was given his emergency chocolate ration, and he was told under no uncertain he was not allowed to touch this stuff unless surrounded by the enemy. And that night, surrounded by the enemy, we all ate our chocolate. So I suspect that that's probably what happened in the marshalling camps as well. And then they sat and waited, did their doby, read the news, and waited until they were called forward for briefing. And there are a whole load of Americans going into the special briefing tents to find out where they were actually going. So going back to this map, we can now decide which of those marshalling areas and hards we're actually going to use. Very early on, they decided not to use the Humber except for ammunition and freight, and not use Great Yarmouth. The Navy complained that the Orwell wasn't dredged deep enough, so they stopped using Ipswich and only used Felixstowe. And they also decided not to use the ones down in Kent in the far southeast, but they would use all of the camps. You'll recall that at the time we were trying to persuade the Germans that we were going across to the part of Calais, and so the camouflage of the camps in the southeast was not as good as elsewhere. The phrase used in the literature is "will show a bit of ankle." You can tell we're in a different politically correct time now, but they were trying to get the Germans to see the troops going through concentration and thinking that they were going through marshalling, although of course the Germans wouldn't necessarily know what those words meant. You'll also see letters underneath each of the camps or the marshalling areas, and those are the naval task forces. So Force U, Force O, G, J, and S. And the names of the beaches on the far side were named after those. So it was the naval forces letters which caused the names to be Sword, Gold, Juno, etc. There was also in the far southwest, there was Force B, which was supporting Omaha and Utah. And out of London and the East Coast was Force L, which was supporting Gold, Juno, and Sword. Everyone forgets about the nattily named Bristol Channel Preloaded Backup Force, which was 2 American divisions coming out of South Wales. And they were due to land late on D and on D+1. If anyone knows about the Wirral, do tell me, because there was an Overlord Plan Z, which had 5,000 people coming out through the Wirral, discussed until the 31st of May, which was, you know, when quite a lot of people were already loading. And yet, as far as I know, nobody went out through the Wirral. So if someone could tell me why they were still discussing it on the 31st of May, that's something which I'd like to know. And you can also see there all of the airborne force airfields color-coded by which divisions were going to go out from each one. The purple one is funny. It's the Pathfinders for the Americans.
Yeah.
And here's a map. Again, you can download it and look at it in detail from the website. But this is the concentration plan for the British and Canadians. And it shows you where all of the follow-up divisions and corps were. And it also tells you in the little boxes, which you probably can't read, it tells you how many troops and vehicles were going to go out on D-Day, and then how many per day were going to go out thereafter. This wasn't actually carried out, because you can see in Area B, which is in the New Forest, it says nil as being the follow-up. But in fact, they decided they needed to use B, but it fed Southampton rather than Lymington. So let's talk about some of the sinews of war, the things which actually we're going to need to move. So petrol, obviously, Patton was supposed to have said, my guys can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas. So he realized that fuel was key to all of this. And you can see a few pictures of the fuel being pre-packed and so on. One of the interesting things, most fuel at that stage was jerry cans. And they put 250,000 tons into pre-packs, which ends up at 14 million jerry cans. And I thought, how can I tell you how big that number is? And I thought, well, if I stacked them side by side, you know, narrow side to narrow side, and I put them in a line, where would it get to? And it actually gets to Cairo, London to Cairo, or London to Moscow, or London to Rome and back again. So we're talking staggeringly large numbers of jerry cans. Every vehicle, for example, had to carry 3 spares. And then other statistics, 400,000 tons of fuel were coming in each month. And I thought, is that a big number or a small number? And it's actually 80% of the amount that we imported in 2021, which was the last year I could get it from. So when you consider how many cars there are on the road now and how few there were in 1944, to have 80% of our current consumption being imported each month is a staggeringly large number. And then random fact, 12,000 tons to take an average bomber raid out to Germany and back. So let's talk about stopping using jerry cans and using pipelines. So there was a great plan, which everybody knows about, called Pluto, which was to take fuel from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. That was actually called Bambi, which was part of the Pluto plan. It, for various reasons, didn't pump its first gallon of fuel until mid-September 1944, by which time the Allies were in Holland. So Cherbourg was not a good place to dump fuel to. So by the end of October, Bambi was closed down. So it only lasted a month. Even though it's an amazing technological feat, it was not a logistically useful feat. However, Dumbo, which came out of Dungeness and went across to Boulogne, did pump about 8% of the fuel that was needed right the way up until after the war. It was actually continued all the way into Germany after it had landed at Boulogne. But the interesting thing is actually not Bambi and Dumbo, in my view. It is all of the pipeline behind it, which you can see.
Yeah.
Because in 1941, the British started to put in that pipeline, which enabled you to put fuel in at Liverpool, Bristol, Thameshaven, or Hull, and pump it around the country to wherever it was needed. For example, up into East Anglia to do the bomber fleets, or down to the southeast or the south to power the invasion. And they started doing that 3 years before the invasion was even decided on where it was going to go. Terribly secret until at the end of the Cold War, and now been sold off. It still exists, but that's the strategic pipeline system. There's Pluto being built. That is at Tilbury, where they made 1.5 kilometer long tubes of steel, or they had two different types of pipeline. I won't bore you with that, but anyway, one of them was steel, 3-inch diameter, and they wound it onto a bobbin. And if you'd asked me whether you could wind steel pipe onto something and it not break, I'd have said you were completely crazy. Thank heavens for the Navy. They came out with a great name for that. That is HMS Conundrum, of which there were 3 or 4. And there it is being towed across the channel by tugs, unwinding. And this is to remind me about that extension of the pipe once it had landed in either in Cherbourg or in Boulogne. The Royal Engineers were laying 20 kilometers of pipeline a day to keep up with the troops. Phenomenal facility, capability. And there are some of the jerry cans being filled. The guys on the right are from the 4th Petroleum Filling Company, Royal Army Service Corps. And we laugh at these units and we think, well, you know, they were not really the fighting edge men and so on. But imagine your world, your war is sitting on 2 upturned jerry cans, filling up more jerry cans day after day after day. Not the most exciting, but without it, we would not have won.
Yeah.
Moving on to ammunition. There's a huge underground cavern at Corsham, which held the majority of the UK stocks, 300,000 tons. To give you some idea of the volumes, they were moving 40 tons an hour in and out of there in the weeks leading the week before and the week after D-Day, all manhandled. So you can see there a picture underneath it at Corsham, and that's a roller track. And you have to pick up a thing of 25-pounder or whatever, put it onto the track and push it. And then someone else further down the line pushes it and pushes it and pushes it. And then eventually it ends up on a train, as you'll see in a moment. 450,000 tons of ammunition came from the States. Where we could, we buried it. So we'd got places like Corsham and Chilmark, Llanberis in Wales, and Fuld in the Midlands. I'll come in a minute. But the majority of, we ran out of underground space. So we had to ground dump it in large forests, such as the Forest of Dean around Cinderford, Savernake Forest near Marlborough, Groveley Woods near Salisbury, and Marston Magna. There are a few little trains. That's one of those at Fuld and one of them at Chilmark. Some naval ammunition at West Dean, trains being loaded underground at Corsham. And that's Fuld, which you may or may not have heard of, but the largest non-nuclear explosion ever, apparently, or maybe it was at the time, and there may have been bigger ones subsequently, but 4,000 tons of bombs went bang in November 1944 underground. The other 20,000 tons didn't, which suggests something about our safety precautions, but it created a crater a kilometre across, killed 70 people, wiped out 2 farms, and you can still see all the evidence of that now if you're interested. November 44, it was completely hushed up, and therefore not a lot of people know about it now. But that's a picture of Fuld underground with, because it was an RAF ammunition dump before it exploded. Normally I'd show a video at this point, which you can also see from the Imperial War Museum site. But a lot of the ground dumping was done in these simple shelters with wriggly tin over a pile of ammunition down the sides of a road. You normally had 100 tons within a cluster and then a quarter of a mile before the next cluster and so on. And normal life just went on around them. at the same time, farming, school kids walking home from school. I would hate to have been trying to guard these things when a school kid comes along and says, I wonder what happens if I drop this shell on its nose. Marston Magna down near Yeovil, I came across the map on the left, which was basically showing where the Americans were going to take over and expand the dump when the British handed it to them. And I thought, I wonder what that looks like on modern mapping. So I put it on modern mapping, 20 kilometers from east to west, 15 kilometers north to south, all of those red roads taken over like the picture, just in the middle of nowhere, not properly guarded or anything. It was quite amazing to think about how much ammunition was dumped all over the UK.
Just a quick question for you about the ammunition, Chris. You're talking about the capacities they can move out of these storage areas. Is that based on literally as much as they can move, they're moving, or are they projecting how much they're going to be needing down the line, or is it sort of a combination of both?
It's a combination of both. So one of the rate limiting steps is the amount of trains that you can move. So I wasn't going to show it today, but I've done some statistics on how much ammunition a port could export in a certain, on each tide or each day. Then how many trains you need to get that amount of ammunition there. Then the outload capacity of the dump. So how fast can it outload? How many trains do you need, and can you fit them onto the railway? And then how long does it take to load the ship? But there was always a call from the far side saying, we're running a bit short of, I don't know, 5.5 ammunition or 25-pounder or explosives or whatever. And then that would be fed back into the system, and the pre-planned quantities would be adjusted to take into account what the front needed. And the same happened with soldiers. So, there was a plan to move infantrymen, signallers, gunners forward. But if the far side said, actually, we're getting through infantrymen at a faster rate than we thought, or actually we're losing gunners at a higher rate, then it was able to adjust to get the right cat badge or right trained people forward.
And continuing that about the artillery, I mean, you are, as a former artilleryman, if, for example, you're the commander of a battery of 5.5s or 3.7s or something, and you're preparing for eventually becoming part of the Normandy assault, maybe not the first day, but some days later, you've got fire plans that you're thinking about using. Would they have been given ahead of embarkation, ahead of going into Europe, an idea of what they can be expected to be able to draw on in terms of ammunition? Because theoretically, an artillery battery can just fire all day if there's ammunition coming. Would they have been given some sort of boundaries of of what they would be expected to use?
Yes, they would. So each battery is told how many rounds per gun they are expecting to use, and then there's usually a small cushion on that. So you might say, right, you can have 450 rounds per gun per day, and that might be ground dumped behind your guns. But you'd be told you can actually fire 400 of those 450, but we need to keep some just in case there's a surprise attack or whatever. And indeed, there is a group of people in each headquarters, artillery headquarters, who are there just to do logs, artillery logistics, and to move ammunition to the right places. So if it's not being used in the south, to redeploy it to the north or whatever.
Thank you.
There's a picture of one of those roller things. That's mainly there to remind you that the black soldiers in the American forces were treated extremely badly and ended up mostly doing pretty mundane jobs. And then down at the on the other side, just after the war, this is a newspaper clipping, the Americans had left a whole load of mustard gas bombs by the sides of the roads up near Sheffield, and indeed in the Forest of Dean as well. And the locals were complaining that it smelt horrible, and they had to keep wearing their old wartime gas masks to feel safe as they walked the dogs or whatever. So vehicles. I don't yet know how many vehicles were produced for D-Day. What I do know is that 130,000 were reassembled in the UK, so they were pre-packed in boxes because it saved 40% of the transport capacity to do that. So they would be built in the States. And you can see all of those Jeeps, for example, already. They would then be boxed, crated, sent across, and then assembled, as you can see on the next picture across. There's a claim that Tewkesbury, the Ashchurch vehicle depot, was making finishing one of those every 3 minutes or something. I don't actually believe that, but they were still producing very large numbers. And it was also done for trucks. So you can see there some trucks being built from kits. We do know that there were 171,500 vehicles in Normandy by the end of the month after D-Day. So in 3 weeks, they'd moved 171,500 vehicles across.
And that's a staggering fact, isn't it? Because when we consider that we're kind of preempting what Niels is going to be talking about tomorrow, that the average German infantry division normally has X number of thousand of horses, is that toe to toe, head to head, there's not massive difference between the Axis and the Allies in terms of armored vehicles, artillery pieces, small arms. But when you compare the tail, as you were talking about earlier, there's a massive difference between the two forces, in that everything pretty much the Allies are bringing across, including the bakeries, is all mechanized. It's all trucks, it's all portable, it's all with tech, whereas the Germans, thankfully for us, just don't have that ability at all.
Yeah, and there are several apocryphal stories, I'm sure, about the Germans saying, well, we knocked out 10 tanks for every one of ours. The trouble is they always had an 11th.
Yeah, exactly. We've all heard that one.
At the end of a day's fighting, the Brits would be able to replace all of their tanks for the following morning, and the Germans would not.
Yeah, the story of Goodwood. Yeah,
absolutely. And here are some vehicle depot shots. The only one I'll talk about is in the top left. That is the Winchester bypass. Luckily, in the late 30s, Britain started building bypasses around many of its major towns. And they were ideal for tank parks because you could keep one carriageway for two-way traffic, civilian traffic, and then the other carriageway, you park tanks down one side and you could still get to them from the other side, if you see what I mean. 800 Churchills and other such things parked at Winchester, and then at Crawley and at Chertsey and at Oxford and. So hundreds and hundreds, indeed thousands and thousands of armoured vehicles ready to go. And then in stately homes and parks around the country, normally between 2,500 and 5,000 soft skin vehicles in each of the parks, and there were of the order of 100 parks, so very large numbers. Few Tonka toys, the spare 40mm Bofors guns, a few pontoons in case there was any water to cross, one of those 900 locomotives being shipped in. I'm hoping there isn't a driver in the truck that's being shipped ashore there. Some of those 900 locomotives, those are at Ebervale in Wales, waiting to be deployed. Medical, just briefly talk about that. There was a requirement for about 90,000 beds that was predicted. The military hospitals could cope with 50,000 or so. The Americans built 40 new hospitals in under 2 years. I don't wish to be political, but we have heard a claim of 40 new hospitals, which never actually showed up, certainly not within 2 years. Generally, the Americans and the Canadians wanted to look after their people in their own hospitals, and the Brits threw civilians out of their civilian hospitals and earmarked 21% of the civilian capacity for casualties. Most of the evacuation done by hospital trains, and I won't bother, but if anyone wants to ask about brief personnel, how they cope with them. Here are a few pictures of the medical chain. So there you can see an LST coming back from Normandy with litter cases in it. By about D+8, D+9, they were starting to do the very high damaged casualties, brain casualties, chest casualties, were able to be air-vac'd out. And when they arrived, there would normally be a fleet of ambulances. That actually is a still from a video which would be playing if this wasn't a PDF. And there you can see some lovely chocolate block with people unloading an LST. put them all into trains. That one is obviously a British one on the left because it's got lots of T, and the other two are American ones. And the idea was that you would come into a port. If you were really, really seriously ill, you would be put into a port hospital, which was actually at that place. Otherwise, you'd be put on a train and taken to an evacuation hospital. So for Portsmouth, it would be Haslar, which would be the port hospital, and then Basingstoke would be the evacuation hospital. And then once you were stable enough to be in a train for 12 or 24 hours, you would then ship further north, Malvern, up into the northwest or whatever, for general hospitals where you'd be kept until you were ready to be evacuated or returned to unit. They built a few airfields. There are 550 airfields in England and Wales, which are all available for you to look at, color-coded. At the beginning of the war, there were 9 airfields with concrete runways in the UK capable of taking one of the 4-engine bombers. Not that we had very many of them in 1939. There were at least 200 of them capable of doing that by the time we get to the 1st of June 44. Obviously, the American and British bomber fleets needed those. A lot of those other ones are training or fighters or whatever, and therefore were still grass strips. But it's still a phenomenal building program that was done. Burton Wood, now under the M62 at Manchester, is the top picture. 11,500 heavies came through there. Most of the heavies were flown over the Atlantic, not only because it was easier than dismantling the aircraft and crating them across, but also you could fly the crew, which saved on the manpower that needed to be moved. However, fighters tended to be dumped on top of oil tankers and things like that. They'd be waterproofed, and they'd arrive in Liverpool or Bristol or somewhere like that, and then be dragged through the town on trolleys to a nearby airfield, Filton for Bristol, or Wharton. Wharton dealt with 14,000 fighters during the course of its life of 3 years, and there are a few more pics. I particularly like the one in the bottom middle of the Lightnings being dragged through the streets. We think that's Bristol. They made a few maps. The maps that I particularly like, as you've seen, that's the one of the New Forest of the same series, Area B. But of course, their main job was making Farshore mapping. And there was the Benson project, which mapped the whole of France. For D-Day itself, they printed 2 million maps plus whatever the airborne used. I can't find that number at the moment, but let's say 2.5 million maps for D-Day itself. But they then printed somewhere around 380 million maps over the course of the rest of the war, so in the 11 months. They had to make the maps from scratch. Of course, they couldn't go there. They had to do it from old maps updated with aerial photography and so on. And most of the maps on the far side were printed from the backs of lorries, things like that. They also made bogus maps, which were real maps, but with all the names changed, so that during training, you could say, okay, we're going to land here. We're going to go up the Ganges. We're going to turn left at Delhi, and then we're going to assault Oslo from the northwest. And when you actually get there, you find that that's landing at Ouistreham and going up the Caen Canal and assaulting Caen. But you could do all of your training without knowing where you're going to be.
I know a Royal Artillery major who actually used one of those maps in Normandy. He never got the updated one, so he would be giving fire orders. Because the thing is about those maps is they ran out of names. So there, on one map, there'd be several Oslos and several.
Right.
But he used that all the way through the Normandy campaign, hopefully without any errors. Coordinates,
any friendly fire. There was quite a lot of training done, so there are some of the training areas that we used. For those of you who are looking at this from outside the UK, this probably won't mean a huge amount, but some of those places are now national parks. So, for example, there is the New Forest training area and the South Downs training area. And we're very lucky that because they were training areas during the war, then when they were cleared of ammunition and things like that, afterwards they were turned into national parks. So some good did come out of it. Where's my project going? So at the moment I'm doing the who was where when, so taking the station lists and lock stats and things like that. I'm not going down to the far right of this, which is to say that this unit sent this vehicle to this ship on this date with this person in charge. But if anybody wants to, absolutely delighted that they can fill in the data. I've made the data so that it can be at that level of detail if you want to, but that's not where I'm anal, but I'm not quite that anal. But I'm interested in ORBATs, so I'm connecting all of the units together. At the moment, I've got about 25,000 units, and trying to work out who was owned by whom at what time, but only up until they get into their boats. Someone else can do the stuff on the far side. Pictures, starting to do this. So if, for example, I know where a picture is, you can click on the map and up comes the picture. Sometimes there's a picture, so the one in the bottom left, Stephen Fisher worked out where it was. So as soon as he worked out where it was, I put it onto the map. And then, of course, as soon as you know where it is, you can say, well, what does it look like today? So you can actually do a before and after. And I think that's an area where I might do some crowdsourcing or something like that, because it's not really something where I could add a huge amount of extra value. A lot of people are interested in airfields. So these maps exist of every airfield. At the moment, my airfields are just a point on the map. It's the center of the runways. But it would be quite nice for some people to see, well, what was the extent of the airfield, and where was the technical site, where was the bomb dump, where was the this, where was the that. So I'm thinking about digitizing all of those, or rather getting other people to digitize them on my behalf. There's some stuff here about time series. This is not complete, but it's just to give an idea. So the idea is here is where were American divisions on particular dates. So you start it going and it shows you that they sort of slowly move, and by 30th of June, there's hardly any divisions left. Now, you're going to tell me that they're wrong, that this is wrong because I haven't got all of the data in there yet. But you can see the sort of idea of moving through to show where all the gunner units went, or where all of the infantry brigades went, or whatever over time. Might be quite useful. And I have found someone who knows where every bit of Mulberry was built, and I thought it would be quite cool to link to his data. And then on my map, you'll be able to see where all the Mulberries were built, and then they all moved down to Selsey and Dungeness, where they were parked, ready to go across. And if you haven't seen it, this is the frontispiece, or the end papers for a book about Mulberry, where all of the objects are depicted as their code names. So you've got whales with little beetles underneath them, taking stuff from the spuds, and you've got little ducks floating ashore and so on. And I thought it was quite whimsical. Legacy. I said I wanted this for 20 years to come. So there's a problem about longevity. In 20 years, the technology will change at least 3 times. How do I hand this over to somebody else? I've talked to several of the museums, and they say, "Oh, Mr. Barrington, delighted to take all of your data. Would you like to leave us 50,000 in your will to maintain it?" And so on. And I'm afraid that my wife's gin habit is such that once I'm dead, she will not want me to have left a large amount of money to keep my hobby going. There's a big difference between the free software that I'm using at the moment and the expensive stuff, which would have much more functionality. But if I have something which costs £10,000 a year to just license, then someone who's receiving it is not going to be so keen on receiving it. So it's a trade-off between cost and functionality. And then there's the problem of crowdsourcing, which I would like to do, but how do you do it? And in particular, how do you do quality control? Wikipedia works because 100 people pile in with their views on something, and eventually consensus arrives. But this is such a niche sport that I think it unlikely that more than 2 people would be interested. And if they disagree on where a unit was or what happened in a particular place, then you end up with a flame war. and there's so much opinion. You know, the number of times I've had someone saying, "Oh, my granny remembers giving tea to the Canadians when she was 8 over her back garden, and it was the night before D-Day, and in the morning they'd all gone. I wonder if they ever came back." You have to say, well, there's no evidence that there were any Canadians there before D-Day, because there were 3 months before on a training exercise, but not on D-Day. And anyway, she wouldn't have been able to get in because of the barbed wire. And anyway, they all got on their ships 3 or 4 days before D-Day, not on D-Day itself. Are you calling my granny a liar? No. And so we end up with a flame war, and I have to back off and say, that's really interesting. So anyway, that's where we're at. There is my contact details if anyone wants to know any more after this. The most important bit is the website address. I occasionally tweet and blue sky as at D-Day Logs, but most of my social is on the D-Day Marshalling Area Research Group on Facebook, which is a private group, but anyone can join it. You just have to ask.
Brilliant. And I'm sure there'll be a few applications. So, well, thanks for that. Masterful. A few of the questions have been addressed by people as we've gone along, as I thought would happen, but there are a few left over. And obviously you're talking about how you use your background in computers to do this data analysis and everything you're doing now. But Peter O'Connell asked earlier on, in the absence of computers, what tools were available to logisticians to manage what supplies and equipment to send where? So back at the time, obviously there's accounting paper, there's abacuses, I guess, and there are, I suppose, some mechanical calculators of some kind. But how is it being worked out?
A huge amount of it's just done manually. So lots of copy typing and big A3 typewriters. However, the Americans brought with them about 25 mechanical record units mobile, which each of which was was 3 trailers, one of which had sorters and tabulators, one which was for filing and one which was for keying, and they keyed onto Hollerith cards, which for those of you old enough to remember punched cards on computers. I learnt my computing on punch cards. It was that. And once you've got the information on a punch card, you can sort it. Admittedly, you can only sort it 1 column at a time. And you can punch a new card based on information from 2 previous cards. So you can do a sort of merge of information. The British bought their first one of these in March 44, and it was shipped with 21 Army Group, but it didn't actually start producing useful stuff until about August. But they were able to get a report of all of the cranes in 21 Army Group in a day, and number of VD cases in 21 Army Group took 2 days. But they could actually produce reports and printouts and so on, not easily and not widely spread, but they could do that. But most of it was manual.
Okay, thank you. Scott Grimwood is asking, for the US, was there any transport ideas transferred from the Pacific? I mean, it's a bit of apples and oranges because we're talking sheer distances over water in the Pacific, whereas a lot of what you've been talking about is over land and then a relatively short hop across the channel. But we talked about the possible liaison, what was happening in North Africa and Sicily and Italy, but the Pacific, are there ideas being exchanged and methods?
I don't know, other than I know that the US Marines they sent some people to the UK to discuss and to learn, and both the European theatre and the Pacific theatre said, you got nothing to tell us. You know, our war's different. And there's I think a not invented here syndrome between the 2 sides. I may be making that too harsh, but I have not found any cross-fertilization between the 2. And you know, one would have thought that some of the stuff which the Marines learnt about amphibious tanks and so on would have transferred, you know, because they used LVTs and things. But perhaps that was later, in which case, why weren't they using DDs? Or was the water in the Pacific so rough that they couldn't? I don't know. But I don't
what
think
we've kind of covered, it seems that the systems are developing in parallel, but really quite separate. There just aren't the people who are hopping back and across from the theatre to kind of exchange ideas. It's happening within theatre. You know, the Australians in the Southeast Pacific are learning from the Americans, but it doesn't seem to be particularly transferable to the ETO. But that's a massive, great rabbit hole to go to. But a great question, and thank you for the response. But from Kevin Getz, I'm going to word it slightly differently. Kevin is saying, what was the level of cooperation with the various towns, villages as men and equipment started moving through the docks, ports? Because some of those maps you've been showing, there were multiple things that might be going through a single area. There might be a marshalling camp, there might be a railway going through it, there might be transport of so. So obviously secrecy is paramount back then, especially in the weeks before June the 6th, perhaps not so much afterwards. But a town, I'm going to pluck a town from my Guildford, let's say. Would they provide a single liaison point who works with the military and then be under kind of the official secrets? Do you know how it worked with that? I mean, obviously you can't have all these town council employees knowing everything that's going on, but how do we have any grasp on how the military cooperated with the civilians?
There was certainly liaison between the two, and there's quite a lot of information which I've read about which maps could be released. So, for example, routes, convoy routes, and so on. There was the map I showed you was the secret version, but there was a restricted version of it which didn't show where the camps were, didn't have any numbers or where the embarkation or where, it just showed the routes. And that was able to be given to the civilian police so that they would know which routes they had to keep open, or which they had to move civilian traffic off of, because there was definitely a deconfliction purpose. Part of the problem was deconfliction between the military and the civilian traffic. And I think reading some of the Home Office documents, there was an understanding that something was happening, but we didn't need to know the details, that the military would tell us what we needed to know.
Well, I think that's definitely something that's come up before, is that we're in an age now where we feel we have the right to know everything, and I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with that. I'm kind of glad that back in the 80s I didn't know how close we were to nuclear war. I think if I'd known that, I'd have hated school even more than I did already. But the idea of back by 1940, everybody within the UK and within the entire system knew that you know, to forgive using a pun, careless talk cost lives. Everybody's in that understanding that just don't ask, just things will happen, don't ask about it, things will pass through, you'll be asked to do something, and you just don't ask beyond what your job is. I suppose that was the set, the rules of engagement everybody in the UK fought under, I suppose.
There were, and I think that most families would have someone or several people in the military, and they knew that their loved ones' lives might be on the line if they blabbed about something. So I think that there was a general feeling of, we're all in this together, we keep stum, we don't need to know all of this information.
Talking of documents, Ian Carr is asking, where have all these plans been rediscovered? So obviously National Archives for some of them. We mentioned the museum in Portsmouth, Southsea there, but where is this information coming from?
So I spend at least a day a month in the National Archives in Kew. I spend a week a year in Washington and in Ottawa at the equivalents there. I have reasonable relations with the military museums, so I've done quite a lot of digging at the gunners, the logistics, the medics, and so on. I've done some stuff in the county record offices, which have got quite good records of some things and appalling records of others, and they're all different. Every county is different, so that's quite painful to go through. And then I get a lot of information just completely randomly. People on Facebook or whatever say, oh, I found this, or I've got that, or have you seen this, or you've read this book, or whatever. And in some respects, I feel like I'm trying to paint a door by flicking paint at it. So I'm trying to cover the whole of this door with black paint. It started white. the door,
Mm.
and I've got a paintbrush full of black paint, and I'm just flicking it at the door. And increasingly, it's getting fuller and fuller and fuller, but there are lots of holes. But I'm hoping at the end of the 10-year project, which I estimate it will be, that the whole door will be painted, and I will have found what can be found, or 80% of what could be found, because of course you'll never find everything.
Well, indeed, and there's a few people in the sidebar already saying that some of your work is kind of overlapping with some of the work they're doing. So I'm sure there'll be some more people in touch with you. And Darren is asking for the Facebook address again, so I'll put it up on the screen there. So D-Day Marshalling and Embarkation Areas Research Groups. Remember, Chris said it's a private group, but you can apply to join it. So there, I'll put that up on the screen.
It's publicly visible, so just put in D-Day Marshalling. And then apply, and Nick West, who's the admin, will let you in.
This is a really interesting question that opens up a potentially massive great rabbit hole. But Grant is asking, with this massive logistical build up to D-Day, did we learn lessons as we prepared during the Cold War? Because I mean, we've talked a little bit in the past about, air raid shelter technology adapting from World War II, from Blitz to V1s and V2s to the potential of a nuclear war after the war. But this idea of moving people around in large numbers, I'm assuming that some of this information was transferable to the next era.
Well, I think that we were able to do things like Suez, for example, was relatively soon after it was within people still serving. So I think that a lot of the things for Suez would have been updated versions of Normandy. But of course, the Cold War was rather different in that it was generally pre-positioned. So, we were sitting in Germany waiting for the Russians to come. Yes, there was a plan to move stuff out of the UK to Germany, but it was using cross-channel ferries and things like that. The idea being that hostilities would not have started when you were moving all of this stuff, and you weren't going to move large amounts of ammunition and stuff like that, because you would have had that pre-positioned in large dumps in Russia, in Germany. How long they would have lasted is, of course, a completely different question. I was in a nuclear missile regiment at the time, so my job was to hide for 3 weeks until we'd lost, and then to run out and throw a nuclear missile at them to tell them to go away. Whether that would have worked or not, I don't know.
Well, and then the last question, or my comment, is going to be about your project and this making it future-proof, tech-proof, and the fact that 100 years on from D-Day, one of the areas we're already encountering is that will be beyond anybody who lived through the war. Some of the first and maybe second ranks of historians will have passed away themselves. So you're into the second and third waves of historians. So primary documents maybe won't be used as much. So making a website like this that the public can contribute to is fantastic, but the public can also contribute information that, as you say, has to be assessed. And we're noticing that now with grandchildren of veterans who remembered, the family has remembered the story incorrectly. I mean, it's just there's no other way of saying it. They remembered the essence of the emotion behind it, and granddad or great granddad or great grandmother was doing this, but over the course of the years, the details have become muddled and murky. So that's this is the kind of issue all historians will be having moving forward, is that cross-checking things with a relatively few number of people who are specialists. I mean, obviously our mutual friend Stephen Fisher has done some incredible work on this. He's down in the Antarctica right now, but there aren't many people out there who've got this ability. Whereas look for historians who know about, I don't know, the different types of Sherman tank in Normandy. You'll find dozens of them, but this is somewhat specialist, which is good, but also a burden for you.
Well, it's, as I said at the beginning, it's what am I going to do with my life if I'm just sitting retired, twiddling my thumbs? Do something which is perhaps useful to other people, and perhaps useful for future historians who maybe they won't have access to the primary documents because. As I pick up old documents which are falling apart for 80 years after, will my successor be allowed to look at the originals? Will it be digitized in time? Maybe not. And so at least they can go to my website and there's a reference which says that this information came from this document, which you can no longer see. You don't have to believe me. you know, I may have got it wrong, but at least it's a starting point to do your own research and your own analysis from where I've got to.
I mean, the digitalization issue is another one in that, as you said right at the beginning of this, lots of work has been done from June the 6th onwards. And as you correctly said, so many books start with the ramp going down of the LCT or the landing craft, the men running up the beach. But the build up, the movement of everybody to be in the right place is a little bit more overlooked. Peter Caddick Adams covered it a bit in Sand and Steel, and other people have, but really a lot of the D-Day content that hits the wider world starts on June the 6th. It starts with paratroopers already out of the aircraft with the tanks on the beaches, and this extraordinary effort to get everybody in the right place has been revealing and enlightening. So thank you very much for doing it. And folks, you know what to do. If you've got any thought that you can help out Chris with his work, either by joining the Facebook group or by contacting him via his website, well, I've put the link in the description there. There's some people out there with some very narrow fields of research. I'm thinking of Trent Tolenko there might have some stuff, Rob Crane and other people with their COP research to do it. So I'm hoping you'll get a little flurry of communication over the next few days, Chris. And in the meantime, thank you very much for an extraordinary presentation. I knew the numbers were big, but some of the numbers you threw at us this evening were extraordinarily big. And it's gobsmacking, I think, is the parlance of the day, I think.
Yeah. But anyway, thanks very much for the opportunity.
Brilliant. So, folks, I'm back again with Niels tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget to click like and subscribe, buy my guests' books, go to their website, support their endeavors where you can. But in the meantime, I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for WW2TV saying enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.